You may have noticed that I'm walking a little gingerly today. Yesterday was not a good day at all because I decided to go horseback riding. Something I have not done in decades. And it turns out that was a big mistake. I got on the horse and I started out very slow, but then the horse started going a little faster and a little faster. And before I knew it, it was going so fast that I just couldn't hang on anymore. I couldn't take the pace, so I was bucked off the horse. I fell off, and I caught my foot in the stirrup of the horse. It was dragging me, and it wouldn't stop. It just kept going around and around in circles, and thank goodness the guy running the merry-go-round finally, he pulled the plug. You knew where that was going, didn't you? Yeah. Anyway, I have to admit, I'm not really much of a risk taker. Not anymore. Maybe when I was younger, I had a tendency to take a few risks. Like when I was 14 years old, a mere 14 years old, I had a motorcycle, believe it or not. And one day I went out riding trails, and I was riding a little too fast, and I hit a bump near the old depot behind the school where I grew up. I had basically some dirt trails back there, and I hit this bump, and I went flying through the air and almost got myself killed. So after that, I started shying away from what I would consider to be risky behavior, like climbing our little town's water tower, which my older cousin was very keen on doing. He loved to climb the water tower. But the truth is, now I'm sort of a playing it safe kind of guy. And because of that, I'm probably a fairly good fit for this congregation. And if I had to grade this church on a risk-taking scale, I would grade you on the side of playing it safe. If there was a continuum over here, here's risk-taking, here's playing it safe, I would say you're further over this way. And I think most of you would agree. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just is. And this is probably why your settled pastors have tended to stay around here for a very long time, especially if they don't have a tendency to make a lot of changes or lead the congregation to take a lot of risks. We call this, by the way, maintenance ministry. And we also call it job security for the pastor. But let me be just a little bit critical about this for a moment. And remember, I'm criticizing you and me. You and me. By playing it safe, a congregation can certainly exist for a long time, as this church has. But if a church ever wants to do more than just exist, then on occasion, and at the right time, and in the right circumstances, it needs to climb a water tower or two. Now, climbing a water tower is very risky because we might fall, we might be ridiculed, we might be chastised. And certainly not everyone in here will agree that we should be climbing that water tower in the first place, whatever that might mean. And yet, if we don't, then eventually we all become too old in the sense of stagnation, and the opportunities to take risks begin to diminish. Now, in our three readings this morning, we see this dynamic between playing it safe and taking risk. There's a dynamic at work in all three of these stories, and I'm going to illustrate how each of the three main characters, Elisha and Paul and Jesus, both played it safe as well as took risks. And then what I'm going to do is apply what they did very briefly to our situation here at Immanuel. First, there is Elisha, the great prophet of ancient Israel. Elisha played it safe by not going to the door to greet Naaman. Naaman was the commander of the army of the Arameans. And so he contracts leprosy or some kind of skin disease, and he decides to go to Elijah's house for healing. But Elisha stayed in his home. He did not go to the door to greet Naaman, because doing so, he thought perhaps might have been a bit risky, because Naaman had an entire army unit with him. And it's not like the nations of Aram and Israel were great friends. So that's one reason he didn't come to the door. The other reason is Naaman had leprosy, which was an unclean and contagious disease. Elisha was not stupid. He was simply being cautious and prudent by deciding to stay away from Naaman for a couple of reasons. And yet, Elisha didn't just play it safe either. The fact that he invited Naaman to come to his house, to him, for healing in the first place was very, very risky. Because to do that, I mean, what if the healing did not work? What if it didn't work? Do you really want to upset the commander of the Aramean army if it didn't work out? Well, like Elisha, this congregation needs to play it safe as well by using caution and prudence in its ministry to others. After all, we live in a world that is not always safe. Let me just be literal for a moment. If I saw a group of men and women with weapons come to the door of the church on Sunday morning asking to see the pastor, I would probably politely decline and then run. I might play it safe in that situation. And yet this is also a story about invitation. Elisha was willing to risk it and invite Naaman to come to him for healing. Is it possible that this is something that we don't do very well, which is invite? As a congregation, we should be willing to risk inviting people we might even perceive to be antagonistic toward us to come here for the spiritual healing that they might possibly find here. Being an extravagant, welcoming congregation is, or should be, risky business. Number two, there is the Apostle Paul. Paul played it safe by encouraging his readers to sow to the Spirit rather than the flesh. Because as he says, we reap what we sow. This is good, safe advice. Sow to the Spirit and not to the flesh. However, Paul could never be interpreted as a guy who never climbed the water tower, so to speak. Because as we know, Paul took the biggest risk of all in the early church by opening the doors to the Gentiles. And he did so primarily by bucking tradition. The leaders of the church in Jerusalem, all Jewish Christians at that time, said that if any Gentiles wanted to become Christians, as I've been saying for several weeks now, they first had to follow the law of Moses. That's step one before you can go to step two. Specifically, they meant you had to be circumcised. Paul risked breaking fellowship with the church in Jerusalem by arguing that the Gentiles did not have to be circumcised. And as I've been saying for several weeks, this was the biggest source of contention in the early church. This was the great debate. Now, like Paul, this congregation needs to play it safe by sowing to the Spirit as much as we possibly can. We cannot go wrong by doing this. No congregation will ever succeed without giving attention, first and foremost, to spiritual matters. That should be number one priority, spiritual matters. On the other hand, like Paul, we can't allow tradition to hinder the Spirit. And so I ask you, is there anything that we, Immanuel, doggedly hold on to that potentially impedes the direction the Spirit wants us to go? Something to think about, right? And then finally, there was Jesus the Christ. According to Luke chapter 10, Jesus played it safe by sending out his disciples in pairs. You might call it the buddy system, right? And there's safety in numbers. Jesus was realistic enough to understand the potential danger of their mission. And he even said to his disciples, "See, I am sending you out like lambs into the midst of wolves." And this is probably why he told them not to take a purse or a bag or even their sandals, and not to greet anyone on the road. Because if the journey truly was that dangerous, then someone might possibly steal their purse or their bag, because that's where people kept their money and everybody knew it. Or they might forcibly take their sandals away from them, because sandals were a precious commodity in a place and time where everybody walked everywhere. Good sandals in that day, they were a first century version of Nike's Air Jordans. People would kill for them. And telling them not to greet anyone on the road was for the purpose of not drawing attention to oneself. It's why people in a New York subway don't look at each other. You don't want to draw attention to yourself. So Jesus could play it safe as much or as well as anyone else. Like Elisha, he wasn't stupid. He was just being realistic. On the other hand, like Jesus and his disciples, we must be willing to risk taking the realm of God, what Jesus called the kingdom of God, to the streets. We can't just sit around and wait for folks to come to us, even if we've already invited them to come. We can't just think, oh, they're going to come. The harvest is out there beyond these walls, says Jesus, not in here. Although it feels to me like we as a congregation are more comfortable seeing the harvest as something that occurs only in here on Sunday mornings. Unless we begin seeing the harvest as something that takes place out there, we are not ever going to have a harvest. This reminds me of a story. An old farmer sat on the steps of his small shack chewing on a piece of straw. He was approached by a passing stranger who was looking for a cool drink of water. Wishing to start a conversation with the farmer, the stranger asked him, "So how is your cotton crop coming this year?" "I ain't got none," replied the farmer. "Well, didn't you plant any?" "Nope. I was afraid the boll weevils would get it." "Well," asked the stranger, "how is your corn then?" "Didn't plant any corn either," replied the farmer. "I was afraid there wasn't going to be any rain." "Well, if you didn't plant any cotton or corn, what did you plant?" asked the man. "Nothing," said the farmer. "I just playing it safe." Playing it safe. It's not always the wrong thing to do. I mean, most of the time it's the right thing to do. And to reiterate what I've already said, a congregation does need to be cautious and prudent and realistic with its primary focus on spiritual things. You can't go wrong with that. And that will keep a church grounded. And yet on occasion, it needs to risk being ungrounded and climb the water tower. It needs to offer an extravagant invitation while at the same time taking the realm of God to the streets. And it doesn't hurt to buck tradition from time to time, just like that horse bucked me off yesterday when I got a little too carried away. So let's find our proper balance between playing it safe and taking risks. And I have to say that I'm all in favor of my job security. But I'm even more in favor of a congregation that is willing to follow its heart, its conscience, and the Holy Spirit to places, people, and situations that might make all of us, you and me, just a little uncomfortable. Amen.